John Bercow was accused of trying to sabotage Brexit last night after he blocked another vote on Theresa May's deal. In a dramatic intervention, the Commons Speaker ruled that the EU withdrawal agreement could not be put to a vote again without substantial changes. He gave Downing Street no notice of his announcement, which came just 24 hours before the Prime Minister was expected to ask the Commons to decide on the issue for a third time following two crushing defeats, as well as sparking a constitutional crisis. Mr. Bercow's move all but killed any prospect of a vote before Mrs. May heads to an EU summit on Thursday. It also means she may have to ask Brussels for a delay of up to 20 months. A senior government source said the Speaker, who is an outspoken critic of Brexit, wanted to wreck Mrs. May's plan of limiting the delay to 3 months. It seems clear that the Speaker's motive here is to rule out a meaningful vote this week, the source added. It leads you to believe what he really wants is a longer extension, where Parliament will take over the process and force a softer form of Brexit. Anyone who thinks that this makes no deal more likely is mistaken. The Speaker wouldn't have done it if it did. With just 10 days to go until Britain is scheduled to leave the EU, the Prime Minister was last night locked in crisis talks with her closest advisers to try to come up with a new strategy. Ministers proposed a string of radical options, including asking the Queen to open a new session of Parliament, in the hope of getting round Mr. Bercow's ruling. In a bleak assessment, Solicitor General Robert Buckland said, "We're in a major constitutional crisis here, a political crisis we want to try and solve for the country." The Prime Minister's doing everything she can to try to break that impasse. There are ways around this: a prorogation of Parliament and a new session. We are talking about hours to March 29. We could have done without this. Now we have this ruling to deal with. It is clearly going to require a lot of very fast but very deep thought in the hours ahead. In a private message to Tory MPs, Brexit Minister Chris Heaton-Harris suggested the EU would exploit the chaos to demand a 5-year delay to the UK's departure, giving the Commons all the time in the world to steal Brexit. He added, "Game over." As Mr. Bercow sparked further controversy by suggesting he might allow MPs to vote on soft Brexit options, Mr. Bercow's decision was welcomed by some Brexiters, who believe it could bring no deal closer, and by supporters of a second referendum, who think it could result in Brexit being blocked altogether. Hardline Brexiter Owen Patterson said, "If the withdrawal agreement cannot be put to the Commons again, we must leave the EU on March 29, as the law demands." Labour MP Angela Eagle welcomed the ruling, saying it was wrong to allow MPs to be either strong-armed, bullied or bribed by the government into backing Mrs. May's plan. But Mr. Bercow enraged some mainstream Tories. Neil O'Brien MP accused the Speaker of double standards, pointing out that he had allowed multiple votes on plans hatched by Remainers trying to block Mrs. May's strategy. And he warned that voters would not understand why MPs were being banned from voting on a deal negotiated with 27 EU countries. Mr. O'Brien said, "If the Speaker were to block a solution, which many of my constituents favor, from even being discussed, on the basis of no principle other than his preferences, then my constituents will be furious with him." It is for Parliament to decide what it wants to do in order to respect the will of the British people, not for one man to decide what should or shouldn't be on the table. James Gray MP said, "Thanks to this announcement, Brexit will not now occur. The people of Britain, the people who voted for Brexit, but also the Remainers who want to see democracy done, will be absolutely furious that their views will not be allowed to be heard in the House of Commons." Mr. Bercow's ruling centred on the long-standing principle that MPs should not be asked to vote twice on the same issue in a single session of Parliament. He said he had allowed a second vote on the deal because it had changed after Mrs May secured fresh concessions from Brussels. But he added, "What the government cannot legitimately do is resubmit to the House the same proposition, or substantially the same proposition, as that of last week, which was rejected by 149 votes." Ministers pointed out that Mr. Bercow had torn up Commons rules in January to allow Dominic Grieve, a Tory Remainer, to throw another spanner in the government's Brexit plans. Mr. Bercow last night suggested he might let MPs use an emergency debate, possibly as soon as this week, to stage votes on soft Brexit options, such as staying in the customs union and single market. Votes on emergency debates are normally restricted to neutral motions. So what does Speaker Bercow's shock move mean for Brexit? Commons Speaker John Bercow announced, without warning, that MPs could not vote on the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement for a third time unless it was substantially different from before. Downing Street was stunned, insisting it had no notice that the statement was coming. Mr. Bercow might argue he is behaving honourably. But at a time of national crisis, when the government is trying to pick a way through the impasse, his intervention will be seen by ministers as profoundly unhelpful. The EU has already said it will not reopen the deal to provide the kind of changes that would satisfy the Speaker. What had been the Prime Minister's plan? After two humiliating Commons defeats for her Brexit deal, one by a record 230 votes in January, the second by 149 last week,